you can all, hopefully you can all see my screen now. I'm here to talk about, says, can't see his own screen, can't see his own slides. I'm here to talk about Martyn's Law, and I think it's probably something which is a hot topic, shall we say, in legal circles, and it's an area of law which produces quite a bit of confusion. I had the honour, really, of being involved in the Manchester Arena inquiry for quite a significant period of time, about 6 years. I was a representative for one of the core participants in the inquiry. And going into the inquiry, I knew of Martyn's Law, I'd heard of it. I didn't know a great deal about what it was, and I didn't really have any particular opinion on it and whether it was something that was required or not. But in the course of that inquiry, I learned an awful lot about Martyn's Law, and an awful lot about why it is required. We have some way to go in the legislation and the parliamentary process, as I'll explain, but it's something which I think will impact all IOSH members, in truth, to some degree, whether they're in the standard tier or the enhanced tier, as we'll come on to look at. So what is Martyn's Law? Well, Martyn's Law is a proposed duty designed to mitigate the impact of future terror attacks within the United Kingdom. And it's two things, really. It's preparation and response, because there is a recognition within government that it's impossible to eliminate all terror attacks, very sadly. So we know that they will happen. So what does Martyn's Law do by way of legislation? Well, it imposes an entirely new duty on the owners of public venues and large organisations, specifically in relation to their publicly accessible locations. And those three words really are key in all of this. As you can probably tell from my slightly weathered appearance, I've been doing this job a while. I can't think of the last time that we introduced a new duty in law which had such significant ramifications for duty holders. So it really is an important piece of legislation. There's no understatement in that sentence. It's also a reverse of the existing contest strategy. Contest is the government's national counter-terrorism strategy. It has various strands. Prevent is one of them, which I think a number of members of this audience will be familiar with. It was subject to some criticism last week by the government's independent reviewer of terror legislation because of concerns that it hadn't been sufficiently reformed. And protect is another aspect of contest. The others are prepare and pursue, which are really about response, shall we say, for state organisations to terror incidents. Protect was something, or remains, a voluntary engagement between counter-terrorism support advisors and particular venues, iconic venues, shall we say. So in Manchester, in the run-up to the Manchester Arena terror attack in May 2017, Greater Manchester Police had a number of counter-terrorism support advisors who would go out and speak to venues like the Manchester Arena, like the National Football Museum, and seek to educate them about the risks of terror attacks and seek to influence the direction of travel in terms of their preparation for things like risk assessments, involvement in local resilience forums, training, the sharing of intelligence, and the like. Now, what Martyn's Law proposes to do is to shift that voluntary engagement into a compulsory obligation for the owners of publicly accessible premises. Just pausing at this point, where are we up to in terms of the legislation? It's been quite a complicated process, in truth. So on the back of the Manchester Arena attack in 2017, the government promised to do something by way of legislation. And that process took quite a bit of time, but it led to a public consultation in early 2021, which some of you may remember. And that public consultation, the results of which were made public in early 2022, produced a broad support for the imposition of what was at that time called a protect duty. That was the business case, if you like, for legislation. In the last Queen's speech on the 2nd of May 2022, the government included a promise to take steps to protect the safety and security of the United Kingdom and its citizens, which was referenced to this bill. And a year later, on the 2nd of May 2023, the Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill was laid before Parliament. Now, after that bill was laid before Parliament, the work of the Home Affairs Select Committee started, and they held various hearings and received evidence from a number of people throughout June and July of last year. and they presented their findings to Parliament with the intention that the government would provide its written response to those findings by, I think it was the 27th of September last year, but they're still outstanding. And that's not uncommon in this sort of parliamentary process. But what we do know from subsequent actions is that the King's speech on the 7th of November last year reiterated the commitment to the bill. And just a few weeks ago, on the 5th of February, the government launched a second public consultation that runs until the 18th of March. That is looking very specifically at the standard tier and how the standard tier should operate. And we'll come on to explain the difference between the two tiers. So why is a duty being introduced? Well, I spoke about this voluntary engagement through the Protect duty between businesses and counterterrorism support advisors. And the reality is that that voluntary engagement doesn't work. It doesn't work because it doesn't provide consistent outcomes nationally. And the example given very starkly between the Manchester Arena and the work that they'd undertaken, compared and contrasted to the National Football Museum, really put that in a particular light and made it obvious that there was a case here to legislate. 2017 was a particularly bad year for terror attacks, as we all know. We've since then suffered the terror attacks, including the Liverpool taxi bomb, which was a significant near miss, the tragic murder of Sir David Amess, MP, in his village constituency. I think that was at a village hall from memory. There was the chap from Blackburn that travelled to Texas to carry out a terror attack in a synagogue. And there have been lots of other incidents and near misses as well. But the primary cause, I think, the primary driver behind, I should say, this legislation has been the work of Fegan Murray. And Fegan Murray is the mother of Martyn, who was one of the 22 victims of the Manchester Arena attack. And I think just to try and bring this legislation to life, it's worth touching upon some of the problems that were identified during the course of the Manchester Arena inquiry. And I appreciate this audience, especially based in South Wales, are not going to necessarily be familiar with the Manchester Arena. The Manchester Arena is a venue with a capacity just over 20,000. It hosts lots of concerts, sporting events. It's physically part of Manchester Victoria train station, which is one of the two big train stations in the centre of Manchester. And because it's part of the train station, it's actually policed by British Transport Police, as opposed to Greater Manchester Police, or it was at that time. The area where Salman Abedi detonated his bomb is an area that was called the City Room. And the City Room is what we would now refer to as a grey space. It's called a grey space because it was occupied by multiple businesses, and ultimately none of those businesses or occupants actually took responsibility for the safety and security of that area. So if we think about the City Room, it's a square space. On the far left-hand side of the City Room, you have the access to the arena doors, and a box office, and you're literally within a few yards to the seats inside the arena itself. On the far right-hand side, there was access to the train station. There was a mezzanine level with a catalogue company, with offices on that level. There'd been a McDonald's restaurant on the mezzanine level as well, but that had closed a few weeks before the attack. You could pass through the City Room to access an NCP car park, and there was a go-kart track down below. The owners of the occupiers, I should say, of the arena, SMG, had subcontracted the security arrangements for the arena to a private security contractor, a well-known company called SHOSEC. And SHOSEC had various personnel stationed around the City Room. But their roles, as the inquiry established, were very specific, and they weren't focused on counter-terrorism. So, for example, there were a number of security personnel that were stationed on the doors, preventing access to the train station, so that people could bypass the barriers, basically. They were also concerned with revenue protection, because a lot of the arena's income is generated from the sale of food and drink and from merchandise. So they wanted to ensure that bag checks were really focused on ensuring that people weren't bringing their own food into the entertainment, and that people weren't illegally selling merchandise at the doors. Very little focus around counter-terrorism support. And the reason for that, and the key takeaway really from the findings of the Manchester Arena inquiry, were that the arena had an inadequate risk assessment. The risk assessment identified that the threat of terror for the arena was low. The national threat level at the 22nd of May 2017 was severe, meaning an attack was highly likely to take place. Why did they have this errant risk assessment? Well, for a number of reasons, really. The risk assessment itself was flawed, so it could only ever produce an outcome that said that the risk was low. There'd been a failure to engage with, I think, experts in the counter-terror field, which meant that practical measures like pushing out the arena perimeter to ensure that large bags couldn't be brought into crowded areas hadn't been considered. There were gaps in the CCTV coverage that enabled Salman Abedi to spend a lot of time in the city room, but hidden on a mezzanine level outside of CCTV coverage. Salman Abedi himself had been to the arena on a number of occasions to conduct what's called hostile reconnaissance. That's where someone who's planning an attack will visit a location to look out for security measures like the number of security personnel, but also the location of CCTV cameras. And he appeared to have clocked in that instance that the CCTV cameras had gaps. What else did the arena inquiry find? Well, the arena inquiry also found that the first aid provisions at the arena were both in breach of the licensing requirements, but also woefully inadequate. And they were inadequate because the first aiders were just that. They were the kind of first aid that you might expect to receive at work, not the level of first aid that a member of the public might expect to receive if visiting a very large venue hosting substantial events. That meant that when the bomb went off, the first aiders weren't able to provide the level of help and assistance that was ultimately required. They weren't able to work in unison with the emergency services, which was absolutely essential, and they couldn't provide the critical level of life-saving treatment that the victims needed, in particular the application of tourniquets to stem catastrophic blast injuries. And that produced, very tragically, the awful outcome where, of course, 22 people died, and there was some evidence that was heard during the inquiry about whether some of those victims could have been saved. That is a substantial part of the business case, shall we say, in government for legislating to deal with this problem. A secondary part of that, if you read the preamble to the legislation, is the cost to the economy of terrorist attacks. And the government places a value on that from, I think it's something like 1997 to 2005. And they quote it at something around £60 billion. And that's before we get into considering the economic impact of the 2017 attacks, for example. So what's the duty in a nutshell? Well, it's three things, really. It's to risk assess the threat of terror attacks in publicly accessible locations, and we're all familiar with the risk assessment process. It's to implement measures so far as are reasonably practicable to reduce the risk of terror attacks. That originally was stated to be an enhanced duty requirement, but this consultation has suggested that, in fact, the current line of thinking in government is that it would be sensible to apply that standard to the standard tier as well. Reasonable practicability is probably a term that most of you are familiar with. What's practicable is what can be done, money and resources, no object. What's reasonable balances the risk, cost, difficulty of implementing those measures against the potential outcome. What we tend to say to our clients is, of course, the outcomes of terror attacks are catastrophic. So the level of care required for reasonable practicability when assessing the outcomes of terror attacks is that much higher than it may be, for example, for slips and trips in the workplace. And then finally, the third aspect is about having robust plans in place to respond to terrorist incidents. That's a substantial area of emphasis in this legislation, in truth. It's about being prepared to respond. It's about organisations understanding what they are going to do if an attack takes place. So where will the duty apply? Well, it'll apply to qualifying publicly accessible locations. That's if you have more than 100 people present. That 100 trigger is based on the maximum capacity of the venue. It'll always assume if you can potentially have 100 people present at a location, if you do periodically have at least 100 people present, the duty is engaged. It doesn't matter that you may be under 100 people, for example, on any particular day. it's the maximum capacity that engages the duty. It also applies to qualifying public events. The consultation gave us a legal definition of a publicly accessible location. It's a legalistic definition, but it's any place that members of the public have access to, whether by payment or otherwise, as right or by virtue of express or implied permissions. So what's the threshold for application? Well, I've just mentioned that there needs to be a capacity of 100. For qualifying events, that needs to be a capacity exceeding 800. And the nature and the extent of the duty really depends on the capacity of the publicly accessible space. But in broad terms, again, it's three things really. So you need to have a publicly accessible location or qualifying event. That location needs to be within a defined boundary. Your defined boundary does not need to be a physical boundary that keeps people in or keeps people out. It can just be the footprint of premises, shall we say. And it needs to be undertaking a qualifying activity. And the bill itself has a schedule which sets out qualifying activities in considerable detail. It is exhaustive. It covers the vast majority of reasons that people will meet in publicly accessible spaces, whether that's in retail, leisure, and sporting events and the like. There are very few exceptions in truth. Who's the duty holder? This is really interesting. The duty holder under the legislation is the responsible person. Now, what do they mean by the responsible person? Well, what the legislation is getting at very clearly is that it wants to hold the controlling mind of an organisation ultimately responsible for discharging the duty. This legislation is undoubtedly going to produce a cottage industry of people offering to be qualified, responsible persons. That's all well and good, and I'm sure that there's some expertise that can be brought to add some help and support for organisations, but it's not what the legislation is seeking. The legislation is seeking a degree of culpability, and that's quite a trend in modern legislation if we think about the authorised person, for example, in building safety. Can we have multiple responsible persons? Yes, in all probability we can. Certainly for qualifying events or premises in the enhanced tier, for example, where you have more than 800 people plus present in a location, it is entirely reasonable to expect that you might have one person who has responsibility for security, perhaps one responsible for first aid, one responsible for events, and so on and so forth. So there will be scenarios where there may be multiple qualifying responsible persons. A common problem that we're asked about is, well, what about premises within premises? So retail units within shopping centres, for example, or grey spaces, as we've talked about in the context of the Manchester Arena. Well, the idea in the legislation is that if you occupy an area with other businesses, other responsible persons, that you should get your heads together and produce a joint plan and share information, and that your planning, your response plan, for example, will be the product of a joint thought process. Now, that's all well and good if everyone is cooperative. What happens if you have a neighbouring unit, for example, in retail, and you may have a number of different neighbours over the course of 12 months, or you may have a neighbour that isn't particularly cooperative or doesn't engage? Well, you'll have the opportunity to go to the regulator through this legislation and ask the regulator to issue what's called a cooperation notice. And that cooperation notice won't just extend to getting the cooperation of neighbours, but it will also assist if there are measures that you feel that you need to introduce as part of a risk assessment process. For example, physical measures like installing barriers outside premises, if you're not getting the cooperation of other organisations. So I mentioned the standard tier and the enhanced tier, and I'll just deal with this these two slides as quick as I can, really. So the standard tier applies where there's more than 100 people that could be present in a publicly accessible location, and it runs to a limit of 799 people. The rest of this slide is all subject to the outcome of the consultation, actually, because what was originally envisaged in relation to the standard tier was a largely online resourced standardized approach that meant you could go on the likes of Protect UK. It would provide you with access to training. It would talk you through a risk assessment process. It would provide everything that you needed by way of resources to support the production of the risk assessments and the discharge of the duty. The government's had second thoughts about that, and to an extent that's because of the work of the Home Affairs Select Committee. I'll look at their findings later on. But what's now proposed is this duty of reasonable practicability, and they've suggested they want to move away from the one-size-fits-all approach to the standard tier and to make it more bespoke. There is a suggestion, though, that the standard tier may not start at 100. So on the very first day of the Home Affairs Select Committee hearings, someone said, why do we pick 100? That's going to engage all sorts of village halls and low-level activities, and this will be a burden to them. Why don't we make it 200, for example? And I think that's what the government want to see by way of a consultation response, in truth. Are we comfortable introducing a duty at that level? Is it going to have a disproportionate effect? Is it going to be something that can be easily discharged? Is it going to cause more problems than provide solutions? So this is very much TBC, but the original intention certainly was very much standardized, easy access with plenty of guidance. The enhanced tier is really quite different to that, in truth, because it's very bespoke. And quite obviously, you might have an organisation that has a maximum capacity of 801 people, like a restaurant that has a very good Saturday night, for example, but it may be quiet during the week. And those premises plainly have very different demands and require very different assessments to the likes of arenas, football stadia, and large venues that have capacity for very significant numbers. So the enhanced tier applies where there's more than 800 people present. The legislation actually allows the regulator to apply the enhanced tier if there's more than 500 people present, but there's a particular issue around an event or type of premises that mean it's advisable to apply an enhanced duty. The best example I can give of where that may apply is if there's a contentious event taking place. So boxing matches tend to attract a particular crowd audience profile. That might be the type of scenario where the regulator might say, actually, this is going to go into the enhanced tier rather than the standard tier. If you're in the enhanced tier, you will need to appoint a designated senior officer for premises or events. You'll need to produce an enhanced terrorism risk assessment. That is something that is going to require a good deal of external input in reality, depending on which sector you're in. So there are organisations, so large arenas, sports stadiums are very good at planning for these kinds of things, in truth, for the most part, the Manchester Arena being the obvious exception. But they will already have expertise in this area. But you can talk to some customers, and I can think of clients that I deal with in the higher education space, for example. Ask them if they've got the skill sets to produce an enhanced terrorism risk assessment. They'll look at you quite scared and say, no, we're going to require an awful lot of help with that. The enhanced duty also requires security measures and the preparation of a security plan. Again, that requires external expertise for the most part, and it's going to require physical measures and processes as well to deal with situations like emergency evacuation. Emergency evacuations can be twofold, really. They can be invacuation and evacuation, and again, that's part of the response plan overall. So what's in scope? Well, I mentioned the three things: the publicly accessible premises, defined boundaries, qualifying activities. So for this audience, you think about town halls where there's an awful lot of over-the-counter activity. Town halls typically have lots of employees inside buildings as well. The legislation's only concerned with the publicly accessible part of those premises rather than the overall capacity for a particular building. It's just the public aspects. Other public buildings, university campus, which will be in the enhanced tier. There are some special cases where certain types of premises will always be in the standard tier. One is religious buildings, which is quite a surprising exemption, really. Religious buildings will always be in the standard tier, with the exception of religious buildings where you may have to pay a fee to enter them. So, for example, if you have to pay a fee to undertake a tour of St Paul's Cathedral, that would be in the enhanced tier of the more than 800 people within the capacity of the premises. Under 18 education, that will also always be in the standard tier. What's excluded? Very little, in truth. When this legislation went out to the first consultation, the idea was that certain sports stadia on the back of the Taylor reforms after Hillsborough were going to be out of scope because they were covered by other legislation already. They're now in scope. The main types of premises and locations which remain out of scope are residential, Transport hubs, so bus stations, train stations, airports, are all out of scope because they're covered by other legislation. Unoccupied premises, but plainly you wouldn't have more than 100 people present. There's also an exemption relating to premises which have a large footprint but low occupation, and that's really getting at sort of warehouses and that kind of location where there would be very little public access, if any. So I thought we'd move on and look at the role of the regulator. And one of the top questions that we're asked is, well, who will the regulator be? And we don't know the answer to that just yet. I know from sitting in on various Manchester Arena hearings that in an ideal world, the Home Office would like to establish an entirely new regulator, a bit like the ICO. The reason for that is that they've looked at the business case for others dealing with regulation, and they're not that keen on any of the options, in truth. So at the time of the original consultation, they considered whether or not local authority licensing might be the best place to regulate. The problem with that is, as many of you know from local authorities, local authority licensing departments are usually vastly under-resourced and overworked, and they don't have the capacity to deal with prosecutions and investigations. The HSE have been considered, but their expertise is in relation to workplaces rather than publicly accessible locations. There was considerations for the EHO, but again, environmental expertise is very different. So we wait and see. What I do know from the information that's been shared publicly is there's the priority, or the preference, I should say, for an independent regulator. And there's a considerable pot of money that's been put aside for regulation as well. It's between 80 and 90 million pounds. So I don't know what it costs to establish a new regulator. I would suspect that's probably around the right amount. And of course, like anything in regulation, there will be a requirement to register with the regulator. I dare say that will involve a fee, and therefore there will be an income generation through regulation, which should help to pay for the process also. The regulator, whoever they may be, has very broad powers. Those powers include gathering information, entering and inspecting premises, and they can issue two types of notices: contravention notices, which require a duty holder to take immediate action. Contravention notice is basically saying to an organisation, you're not compliant with your obligations under the Terrorism Prevention of Protection of Premises Bill. And a restriction notice. A restriction notice is a bit more draconian. That can shut down part of the premises or a particular activity or an event or part of an event. And that will have a more significant impact, shall we say, in the event of non-compliance. So the regulatory enforcement regime has been subject to some criticism because it's primarily a civil sanctions regime. And the chair of the Manchester Arena inquiry, John Saunders, said at one of the hearings when he was asking questions of the Home Office, why does it only become a criminal offence after there's non-compliance? Shouldn't it be a criminal offence in the event of non-compliance? Why does it take the issuing of a contravention notice or a restriction notice to get it to that stage? And I don't know the answer to that, and there wasn't a really persuasive case. But I think the approach that's been taken by governments is to try and hit organisations with large fines in an effort to discourage non-compliance. And you see that in the level of fines that are levied here. So if you are issued with a contravention notice in the standard tier, you could be fined up to £500 a day, capped at a maximum of £10,000. However, if you're in the enhanced tier, the daily fine could be 1% of the final fixed penalty, and the final fixed penalty could be up to £18 million or 5% of global turnover, or in the case of local authorities, probably budget. They come to some very, very significant sums. There are criminal offences under the bill. The criminal offences are offences that are likely to be tried through the magistrates' court in the first instance. Things like failure to comply with a notice, providing false or misleading information, attempting to obstruct the regulator. And this last one is interesting because it feeds into wider considerations, and that's an offence of intentional neglect. What that's getting at is a scenario where an organisation makes a calculated decision. It's cheaper to not comply and risk a fine than comply, so we'll take a chance. Now, One point to make here, which is why I say it has wider implications, is that when this becomes law, if an organisation fails to comply with its Martyn's Law obligations and a terror attack takes place at their premises, resulting in the loss of life, it's entirely conceivable that that could lead to charges of gross negligence and manslaughter. And it is very significant. This is legislation, I think, which has some bite. And, you know, the civil sanctions regime puts it on a slightly strange footing. It's a strange place to start, but it has wider criminal implications from a regulatory perspective. So what about civil liabilities? This is where it becomes really, really interesting, because I'm by background a civil practitioner. Originally I was. Now, the law as it currently stands is defined by a case called Al-Najjar and the Cumberland Hotel. Al-Najjar is a decision from 2019, and it concerns, I'm sorry, move slides on. It concerns an assault on a family of, I think there were Saudi nationals staying in the Cumberland Hotel. The Cumberland Hotel had a restaurant on the ground floor, which members of the public could access. And I think there was a nightclub or a bar as well. And again, people would tend to wander in off the streets and visit those locations, in addition to the guests staying at the hotel. It was suggested in the evidence a bit of a history of people finding their way up towards guests' rooms when they shouldn't have been there. But the hotel had certain measures in place, including CCTV and a concierge, whose role it was to ensure that people didn't find themselves in the wrong place and the guests were safe. The Al-Najjar family followed a Middle Eastern custom, which apparently is to leave your bedroom door slightly ajar. Now, unfortunately, on this particular occasion, a burglar found his way into the upper floors of the Cumberland Hotel, and on finding the family's doors ajar, he took the opportunity to try and carry out a theft, but he was disturbed by the family during the course of the robbery. He took that opportunity then to assault those family members, and they sadly sustained serious brain injuries. And they brought a claim against the hotel, suggesting that the hotel were negligent, that they'd owed a duty in common law, that they'd breached that duty as a consequence of the attack. Now, their claim ultimately failed, and it failed notwithstanding that the court accepted that there was a common law duty to protect guests from criminal acts. But it failed because the court was satisfied that the hotel had taken reasonable steps through the use of CCTV and the presence of the concierge to ensure that guests were kept safe. Now, under the Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill, there's no direct cause of action to bring civil claims. However, it is entirely conceivable if an organisation is not compliant with its obligations under the bill and a terror attack takes place, that will be compelling evidence of negligence. That fundamentally changes the picture in relation to civil liabilities which arise from terror attacks. If you look at the cost of the Manchester Arena inquiry before you even get into the claims picture, the inquiry itself probably cost upwards of £100 million, taking account of the costs to the core participants. It's a very significant financial burden, certainly something which would exceed the limit of indemnity under most insurance policies. And then, of course, sadly for the Manchester Arena attack, there were 22 fatalities and a very significant number of additional victims, running well into the hundreds. And as a consequence of that, it's the kind of thing which will attract significant civil liabilities. It will reframe the law in the future, bringing the opportunity for claims to be brought on the back of terror attacks. And that's why it's so important that organisations are entirely compliant with their obligations under the legislation. So I mentioned earlier on that the Home Affairs Select Committee have been picking apart this legislation. What did they find? Well, their concern really was that they felt that there was a lack of clarity as to the purpose of the bill. And to put that in stark terms, the independent reviewer of terror legislation said to the committee, this legislation goes further than any other counter-terror legislation anywhere in the world. And I found that a really surprising observation, actually, because we have some fairly unstable regions in the world, as we know. But apparently this goes much further, and that touches upon this concern around the standard tier. The additional concern, which is well made, is that there's very complicated drafting. That's not uncommon in legislation, but critically, a lack of guidance. There are lots of organisations out there currently, when you Google Martyn's Law, that tell you they can help your organisation get Martyn's Law ready. They can't. We don't have the guidance. We don't know what's going to be required under the guidance. And until we see that, you can't be compliant. You can start the process of preparing, undoubtedly, but you can't be compliant. So the sooner that guidance is released, the better. And it will provide some certainty around how this legislation is going to operate and what needs to be done. Further criticism was the lack of information around the identity role and powers of the regulator. And there was this concern around proportionality for the standard tier premises. They made various recommendations. Guidance to assist with compliance, that's obviously critical. Mandatory life-saving training was something which has cropped up a number of times. Staged implementation of the bill. Staged implementation of the bill is an interesting one in its own right, because the chair of the Manchester Arena Inquiry felt that there was a compelling case to introduce the enhanced tier duties now. He accepted, if there's a problem in relation to the standard tier and it needs to be thought out, let's not jeopardize lives, I think was the way he put it. Let's get on with introducing the enhanced tier, and we can phase it in relation to the standard tier when we know what works best. That's something which I think will ultimately happen. And then finally, this last point is interesting. It's statutory standards for new buildings. That's really driving at ensuring that suitable security measures are included in planning permissions. So if you're building an arena, it's got an appropriate security cordon with barriers, the right security features, that buildings generally have plans for evacuation and evacuation, for instance. And that's something that the bill doesn't really seem to address currently, which is has not been responded to yet by governments, but it falls outside largely, I would have thought, the standard tier, something we might hear more on when we get the results of the consultation. So some practical considerations, really. As I say, you can't be Martyn's Law compliant just yet, but you can start to take some steps to work towards compliance in the future. Martyn's Law, I'm very confident, is going to become law. It's no secret we're going to have a general election in the near future, certainly before the end of January next year. The bill was put before Parliament in May last year. The government response to it is overdue. It needs to undergo a number of readings in Parliament and then off to the Lords and get royal assent before it becomes law. It will probably not become law before until 12 months after it receives royal assent. So it's a way off in terms of becoming a legal obligation, but it's going to require a lot of work to get there. What happens if we have a change of government? Well, certainly as of 2019, the Labour Party were supportive of this legislation. I've not heard anything that leads me to suggest that they've changed their minds. There may, of course, be some degree of tinkering around precisely how the legislation works, but I think we can accept that it's likely to happen and that there is a compelling case for it to happen. And certainly the chief constables of multiple police forces and many former Home Secretaries all make a compelling case in that regard. So things you can start to do now. Well, identify what premises that you have that might be in scope, and then have a think about which tier will apply. The common feedback that we get is that organisations don't really know what the capacity of their premises are. Now, in licensing, it used to be the case up until about a decade ago that licenses would actually stipulate the number of people expected to be present in a venue, but that was taken away, and it's probably going to have to come back in truth, because licensing will obviously run hand in hand with obligations under Martyn's Law to ensure that organisations are compliant. If you're unsure, start to get some data to look at occupancy numbers. There are plenty of organisations out there that have already started to think about this. And for some organisations, and I'll give you an example of theatre groups, for instance, they've already made the decision that actually to keep their organisation within the standard tier, they're not going to open their bars to members of the public during theatrical productions, because that may push them over 800 on a typical basis, whereas they wanted to keep within the standard tier. So if unsure, obtain data around visitor numbers. I've mentioned licensing implications already, certainly checking the provision of licenses, and there will be a role for local authorities in the future of ensuring that when licenses are issued, that they're issued to be compliant with Martyn's Law obligations. Events are going to be a particular problem, and they're going to be a particular problem for the public sector, especially because events aren't always controlled by the sector. Quite often, the sector will allow other organisations to use their premises, whether it's for charitable purposes or commercial purposes. Events can be run by external contractors that may bring in external security, for example. They can bring with them certainly the potential for liabilities here and the potential for regulatory breaches as well. So ensuring that events are well run is going to be a bit of a moving feast. From a contractual perspective, it's really important to look at contractual indemnities and risk transfer in relation to events in the future to ensure that there's a contractual obligation to comply with Martyn's Law obligations, to ensure that you know who's going to do that, how it's being done, and that you hold plans, particularly if an event's taking place that's being run by someone externally, that you know that they are fully compliant, and indeed that they will indemnify you in the event that they're not. And of course, we know that indemnities can be rather challenging and aren't always enforceable and don't always achieve the outcomes that they should seek. Training is going to be really important. So start to think about who you will need to train and how often you'll need to repeat that training. Are you going to do that training externally? Are you going to use the online resources that might be available through Protect UK? Third-party contracts for security, mentioned indemnities as well. Grey spaces, I mentioned the arena scenario where no one was really taking responsibility for an area of land that needed to be well managed and carefully managed. Have a think about whether your organisation has any grey spaces, and if you're going to engage with neighbours, who you should be engaging with, who your key contacts are, and be realistic about how long that's going to take. CCTV is a common issue. If you've got CCTV, are there blind spots? Can you resolve the blind spots? Who has control over the CCTV? How's it shared? All those kind of things. Are they trained as well? And then a final one, really, which is just a really easy win, and that's monitoring the national threat level. When the national threat level changes, it changes for a reason. So it was severe in 2017. It's gone down from severe since. But if it moves, it's really important that organisations share the fact that the threat level has moved. If it's gone up, very plainly, that requires a level of vigilance. There needs to be evidence that's communicated throughout organisations that people have thought about it and shared the information. And then finally in the slides, I've just included some links to useful material, including the consultation and the action counter-terrorism guidance. I haven't looked at the questions in the chat, but I can see there's quite a lot in the chat, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that arises from that.
Thank you very much, Paul. Very good. So let's have a look at the chat. You'll find it. And go through the questions.
Some technical issues in the earlier ones.
Yes.
Do we have any idea about whether the potential change of government this year will have any effect on what's being proposed now? Only what I've said, which is that the Labour Party, if they are the incumbent government, will continue with this legislation. It's got an awful lot of support cross-party, so I think it will still happen. Inevitably, there might be some tinkering. There's some very interesting things on the Labour Party agenda, and I said I'm entirely politically neutral, by the way, but there are some other things that they have on their agenda which sort of strike a tone with this as well, not least around ensuring accountability for supply chains, for example. So there's a lot of accountability measures that they have planned by way of legislation. Was there any consideration of the building safety regulator as the regulatory authority? I don't think so. I don't recall that being mentioned, but of course there is a great deal of expertise there, and that would make an awful lot of sense, actually. School heads are panicking.
one before that. My question is, do you think the regulator, once established, would introduce and specify a level of skill or competency for Martyn's Law responsible person? If so, would you likely have implications on the provision of trainage to meet this criteria?
Good question. Well, we don't know is the answer. If you think about the number of premises that are going to be in the enhanced tier, because I think really the responsibility around the filing of response plans, for example, is primarily focused for regulatory purposes in the enhanced tier. Government's assessment was that there was around about 26,000 premises that would be within scope of the enhanced tier. So the regulator is going to have to receive 26,000 response plans, plus all those queries for the standard tier. I don't think in the first few years they're going to have time to review all of that and to provide a thumbs up, thumbs down, or to authorize responsible persons or not. But over time, they'll want to educate and they'll want to encourage good practice. And there's going to have to be some guidance around responsible persons, particularly in the context of the desire for the responsible person to be the controlling mind of an organization, not a health and safety professional necessarily who can discharge the duties because of expertise.
So it could almost become a bit like fire then, where you got the person responsible for fire safety could be a totally different person from the person responsible for fire.
Exactly. And again, it comes back to culpability because they want to be able to hold someone accountable for a failure to comply rather than engage with experts in the field. But the message around regulation that came across at the Arena inquiry was an approach very similar to the ICO of seeking to educate in the first instance rather than approaching it with a big stick, large fines, prosecutions. It was all about encouraging compliance, and I'm sure that will be the case for at least the first 24 months after it becomes law.
Fun of catastrophic bleeding in first aid at work, optional element, and not many of the awarding organisations show it was covered or not by the learner on first aid at work certificate. Do you think that will change?
That's really interesting, and it wasn't something I was aware of previously. Will it change? It might do. That will depend on the risk assessment process in all probability. So for organizations that have substantial premises, which include large publicly accessible locations, where there's a higher risk, shall we say, of a terror-related attack taking place, it's going to be a more compelling case, isn't there, for that level of first aid at work. Certainly, it's going to become something I would imagine that will be compulsory for venues like the Manchester Arena. So if you've got large audiences attending events, they're going to have the requisite standards of first aid. And it's worth emphasising that the Manchester Arena were actually in breach of their licensing requirements with the first aid provision that they had that night. The first aiders hampered the emergency response. They were, in some instances, covering over victims of the attack, believing that they were dead when they were actually alive. And the chap that led the first aid response was, I think it's fair to say, unimpressive. He wasn't well prepared. He didn't have any formal medical qualifications. He didn't provide urgent information to the ambulance service, and it was quite chaotic, and I think they hampered the response quite considerably. So yes, keep an eye on that. And I think certainly as part of this process, every organisation should be reviewing the level of first aid capability.
ACT training. Apparently, Staffordshire counter-terrorism officers have recommended ACT training. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a really good idea. It's a good idea for all organisations, and for the local authorities on the call. You'll almost always be involved in local resilience forums as well, which are really good places to share expertise, to make contacts with relevant experts in other organisations. For some of the local authorities as well, you'll have safety advisory groups. They'll already be active looking at licensing around football stadia, for example, and they'll have a good deal of in-house expertise. So I know a lot of this feels like it's entirely new and very alien and not an area of expertise that we already have, but there will be organisations in the public sector in particular that can draw on a good deal of resource and expertise internally.
Do you think that schools and councils will be able to outsource this duty?
No. They may be able to delegate some degree of compliance. So you know what it's like producing risk assessments, for example. I mean, dealing with litigation, I see these beautiful risk assessments, and I look at them, and there's all sorts of scoring. They're fantastically presented, and then I speak to clients and say, "Can you talk me through this risk assessment and how you've ended up with this score and how this actually works?" And I tend to get some puzzled looks back, and you dive beneath the surface and you can find, well, actually we can't explain this properly, or typically you'll ask the question, well, did you think about this as a risk? Did you consider this particular measure? Oh, we don't know. So my best advice is, if it's going to be outsourced, just ensure that you understand it properly. There's going to be a need, as I've explained, to get some external expertise around enhanced level terror risk assessment, security plans, the like. They're going to be areas that we don't have any natural expertise in, that we're going to be reliant on others. But just ensure that you document the thought process. So if you've considered something, for example, but you've excluded it because you thought it was perhaps a low risk, or it wasn't going to work in practice, just spell that out in your documents, because there's no harm in making a decision using the right risk-based approach.
From Nevin, given the introduction of Martyn's Law and the existing Building Safety Act in Wales, what are the key intersections and potential synergies between these regulatory frameworks? And how do you anticipate organisations navigating compliance and enhancing safety measures accordingly, possibly with different regulators?
I think that is exactly the answer. I suspect there will be different regulators working to different agendas, and again, it's a very difficult question to answer, because we're obviously in the early stages of the Building Safety Act, and we are some way off yet Martyn's Law becoming law. Is it a business health and safety issue? Is it a business resilience issue? Certainly in relation to terror attacks, that becomes a resilience issue, and that is obvious from the likes of the Civil Contingencies Act, and it's also obvious from the government's business case, because not only do you have the human tragedy of loss of life and the impact and lasting impact on victims of these attacks, but there's the huge financial cost to the economy as well, and to economic activity, and to the lack of confidence. And that's why I'd say it's a resilience issue as well. Someone's mentioned earlier in the chat the Citizen Aid app. It's a brilliant app, which I think it's fair to say, I've got it on my phone. It does give you guidance on your smartphone as to what to do in the event of an attack to help with emergency first aid. Well worth downloading.
That's just for individuals, though, isn't it? Not for, yeah.
Organisations can use it in exactly the same way. It's free. It's something you just download onto your phone, and it gives you that on the spot. What do I do? It requires a degree of composure in the moment, undoubtedly, but the Arena Inquiry had some evidence about Citizen Aid and thoroughly endorsed it.
So what if you were, say, a small committee or charity running a carnival procession around the town and the streets were lined with public? How would this be managed?
It's quite an interesting question, and it crops up quite a lot. So Martyn's Law won't apply to highway, because that's part of it's out of scope effectively. It's not publicly accessible location with a defined boundary. If the highway is closed for an event, so if there's a closure order, then arguably the obligations under the Highways Act cease to exist, and it becomes an occupier's liability. And in that scenario, if you've got more than 800 people present, it's an event, and you would need to comply with your obligations for the enhanced tier. So you would need to have a think about what's the footprint. So is this in a publicly accessible location, or is it a qualifying event within a defined boundary? That's where the use of highway comes into consideration. Is it open to everyone? Are they just walking down the streets? In which case, not sure Martyn's law would apply. Pretty confident it wouldn't, because there's no defined boundary. If there is a boundary and there's either ticketing or the security, external access, that probably would be in scope, in my view. And a procession would be a qualifying activity.
So anything like Notting Hill or big carnivals like that certainly are going to fall in, aren't they?
Yeah, and where I live in Manchester, we have lots of events where the highways are closed, particularly in the centre of Manchester for various events, sporting events and the like, which are likely to be in scope.
So Tracy's asked a question. We have a number of open spaces within the Caddo estate that easily accommodate 800 plus people, but usage is often very low. Can we risk assess out the need to manage tier 2?
You'd need some pretty good evidence. So if the obvious capacity would be in the enhanced tier, if there are occasions where you have that capacity where you have more than 800, then you would be in the enhanced tier. You can make a submission to the regulator, and when the regulator's eventually established, to say this is our case, our maximum capacity is such and such, but we have carried out these studies which demonstrate the actual capacity of these premises ranges from this to this. Do you agree within the standard tier?
So could you limit it by people? So thinking, well, somebody's put the event at the Food and Drink Festival at Caerphilly Castle. If you put a limit on numbers, would that
799?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that would produce a compelling argument, wouldn't it? To say this is a standard tier event and we've only issued X many tickets within 800. It would all have to be signed off by the regulator, though. So I think we're going to get lots of questions like this, and there probably will be some regulatory guidance which will ultimately help. But if in doubt, there's always the power to ask the regulator.
So got one there saying, think eliminating a hazard should be the priority and the mitigation should be treated the same as a major accident, same as coma. Do you think it would be viewed that way?
Prevention's always better than cure, isn't it? But what we've seen in the last few years is the changing face of terrorism, certainly since 9/11. And what I mean by that is, as a kid growing up in the 80s, it was quite common to unfortunately hear about IRA bomb threats, for example. But more often than not, it was the threat of what might happen.
I believe we've just lost him.
As a kid, terror threats I used to experience as a kid were very different to the kind of terror threats that we sadly see now. So the IRA threat in the 1980s was principally one that was designed to cause distress and alarm, but with exceptions, not necessarily the level of loss of life that you now see. The current terrorist methodology is marauding terror attacks. Marauding terror attacks are designed to injure and kill as many people as possible in the amount of time permitted, effectively. And that is something which is very, very difficult to deal with. It's difficult to stop. The emergency services obviously struggle. They have a number of people that they actively monitor. But we know from the findings of the likes of the Arena inquiry that it's not possible to monitor everyone all of the time. There will be certain people that slip through the net. And that's why there's this case for legislation. And I think on top of that, the various chief constables of a number of police forces have always felt that organisations, particularly in the private sector rather than the public sector in truth, have always had a bit of a not our problem, your responsibility attitude to terror prevention. And that's why this legislation is focused upon preparation and response. It's about ensuring that organisations know what to do if they get caught up in the middle of an attack.
Brilliant. Somebody's put, I don't think limiting numbers to below 800 is ethical and would probably be frowned upon by the regulator. I suppose that's something they would have to consider, isn't it, within the evidence as to why and how accurate you were to those records.
I'd be really troubled as well if I was told that there's an event and we've sold 799 tickets. Because it's so close to the capacity that the regulator's probably going to say, well, okay, well, what are your measures for ensuring that there are just 799 people
there? Is it known at all around the responsibility for event runners versus site controllers who would ultimately be responsible during events? Or would it just be similar to different sites being required to work together?
Yeah, a bit of both, I suppose. I think the defined roles would really depend on where they sit in the security plan and the response plan. And that's all about the risk assessment process and the preparation. But it comes back to the multiple responsible persons point. That
obviously then got to be control in mind as well, isn't it?
Yeah. That's why it's so important to ensure that everyone is clear about what their role is and that it's adequately documented somewhere.
Yeah. Be it responsible officer or whatever. I'm just checking. No, I think that's all the questions, unless anybody wants to raise their hand and ask. No hands. So, well, I suppose all that remains is me to say thank you very much, Paul. Really informative. And hopefully we'll see you again in the future. You've put your email in the chat, so if anybody wishes to email you, then please feel free to get in contact with Paul. I'm sure he will answer you promptly. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you all. Thanks for your time. Take care.